right. Okay, all right. So we are in James chapter 1. We're now in verse 16, 17, and 18. And remember, what we talked about last week was that James had previously said, hey, look, you're to persevere. And then he said, two benefits of perseverance is you'll be blessed in this life and you'll be blessed in the next life. You'll have your crown of life in the next life. And then last week we talked about, then James then says, but hey, if you don't persevere, don't blame God for it, right? If you fall, if you say, I just can't, there's temptations and I just can't do it, God, I can't persevere through it. James says, you can't blame God. You're commanded to persevere. God has promised you blessings for perseverance, but if you don't persevere, it's not God's fault, right? And it's all because of your desires that he said when desire grows to its full capacity, it leads to death, right? That is the final outcome. And then he goes on now, he's going to give what's really the positive side of this whole thing. He then says, but do not be deceived, my beloved brothers, for every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Now, what is James doing here? Again, it almost seems like this is starting some new topic. What's the purpose of him talking about good gifts and things? Well, the purpose of him talking about this right here is that we have to look to the immediate context. What good gifts is James referring to? Now, he says every good gift, so that means every good gift that happens to us comes from God. But what is his point in mentioning that right here? What's the purpose? Just from the very immediate context.
Yeah, just giving you all the negative things. Now he's getting into the positive things. So stop being into things that aren't of God and keep acknowledging Him. Everything good is coming from Him. Come on. That's the way I look at it. And that was one, as I became a believer, that was one of my favorite verses that I would share with everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's part.
Pull a Randall here.
Yeah.
If I may.
Yeah.
If there are good gifts, are there bad gifts?
Sure, he just mentioned them in the prior verses.
Oh, he did.
He didn't talk about gifts, but here's what he said. If you go back to the prior verses, he's talking about, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Remember this whole thing. So what we think is a good gift is nothing but false bait. It's nothing but desires that cause sin, give conception to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, results in death. So when we think of pursuing stuff, when we think about we're called to persevere, but then in life we look at something and say, "Oh, I want that." That is a good gift. James is going to say that's not a good gift. That's death. Open that thing up, take a sip. It's like having a nice chocolate brownie that's filled with arsenic. It might taste good going in, but I'm telling you, it'll kill you coming out, right? So that he didn't mention gifts in the one, but that's exactly what his reference is to this whole thing, to say, look, you think you know what's good for you. You think you know what the good things are in life, but those good things, if they are not desires that are aligned with God's purpose, they will lead to sin, and sin will lead to death. Now he's going to say, but don't be deceived here. The one who gives you good gifts is God, right? So what you think is good ends up resulting in death.
So in the struggle to discern that, I'll say,
Yeah.
to be able to tell the difference between the two, or is that part of endurance and testing and tempting and all of that?
Let's start before that with wisdom.
Yeah, so if you want wisdom, so if you want to look at James, remember James talked about if anyone lacks wisdom, ask of God, and He gives it generously. So that
the application of that.
Almost everything going forward in James relates back to wisdom.
Okay.
And that's what I was going to say, Joe. Is that
Well, sorry.
no? This is no. You're actually you're getting
I
the.
got here early and read.
You're getting the flow of James. In fact, if you read through the rest of James, when he talks about controlling your tongue, when he talks about different things, that all relates back to wisdom. Wisdom is the right application of true knowledge, right? And so when we control our tongue, let's say, or when we don't treat one brother better than another brother, when we don't show favoritism, right? When we don't get angry and upset because we don't get our way, and then we do things like murder and steal and that kind of stuff. Like, these are all using wisdom in our daily life. So yes, Rich, the wisdom is us being able to be wise enough to discern what is an evil gift, in this case, that we either want to offer ourselves, or the devil or the world wants to offer us, that we take thinking it's good and it ends up resulting in death and calamity and destruction. Or we're wise enough to understand what God's gifts are, the good gifts. And so that's why James brings this up here. Now, the other thing that he ties this into, so there's two kind of an immediate context which would relate to this gift. The first one is what I just mentioned. The second one is just preceding that, which is he says, hey, look, you are to persevere. And when you persevere, these are going to be your benefits. And that if God has commanded us to persevere and he's promised benefits, he will give us the gift of, as James has already said, the gift of grace to be able to persevere. Grace in itself is one of God's ultimate gifts. So I think James is referring in the very immediate context, and then in the general immediate context, to those two things. Those are the gifts. The good things that come from God. When we desire something we should desire, he says, no, pursue the things of God. God will give you good gifts if you pursue his way. But God will also give you the good gift of grace in order to persevere through all the things that you've got to get through. Those are all gifts, right?
And grace is sufficient for you.
Correct?
Yeah.
Correct. And it is a gift. And I think we've all experienced that, where we think we're not going to get through something. And God is there, his presence is there, and that is a gift because you can't muster that kind of stuff up, right? It has to be delivered by God. Now, I love it right here where he says, don't be deceived. That is an imperative. That is a command, right? You are not to be deceived. You are to use wisdom in every situation of life. Do not be deceived. It's a command. And then he follows it up with my beloved brethren. So he's obviously writing, these are believers, but he calls them beloved brothers, not just my brothers, but beloved brothers. And so again, this is sort of that pastoral heart where he would reach out to him and say, look, I know life's tough. You're beloved. You're loved. I care about you. And Joe, you and I were talking about it this morning about just the need for getting together, where as fellow believers, Rich, to your point earlier, it's fellow believers that can speak into our lives too. I love you. If I see something that's not right, I need to speak into that. Or if you're struggling with something, I think you talked about that last week or the week before. That's part of how we can kind of get through that and persevere. But his address them as beloved brothers shows his care for them, knowing that life is not always easy. Right? All right, so again, he warns them not to be led astray, not to be deceived. And then verse 16 is really a transitional verse between what we had in verses 13 through 15 about pursuing our evil desires and sin being conceived and leading to death, and what he's going to add in verse 17 and 18. So this goes back to the fact of, I've told you, here's the evil stuff, and then do not be deceived as sort of this bridge or this transition to now here's the good stuff, right? So that's how we should look at this. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived about the evil stuff. Don't be deceived about what we think is good but it's not. But then also don't be deceived about where the good stuff comes from. It all comes from God. Every single good gift comes from God. Okay? All right. Oh, hold on a second here. I got it. There we go. Okay. So he says every good gift, right? And the word, good here just means beneficial or profitable, right? In other words, it's beneficial, profitable for us in some way. Spiritually, could be physically, could be relationally. Like, it's something that God knows is going to be beneficial. Now, we don't always see things as beneficial. Like I was talking to you this morning about working out. Sometimes I do not enjoy the process of working out, but I know it's beneficial, right? So we tend to think of good things as things that only make us happy. And that's not what James is saying here. He's saying that everything good that produces a benefit in our life, that is profitable in some way, is what comes from God. And sometimes what's beneficial and profitable is God's discipline. So we don't want to read this verse here and only think of the nice house we've got or the job or things like that, which is, a lot of times we tend to go and look at, all that kind of stuff, which is true. The food that I had to eat, whatever else, like this all is because of God's provision. It really has a much broader emphasis of what's beneficial and profitable for us in our life. And sometimes that's going through trials and coming out the other side with our faith being stronger. That's a benefit. The trials themselves can be benefits. And so James says that I don't want you to be deceived here. This whole process of going through trials and going through this whole thing of perseverance, that in of itself leads to a benefit. And so that can be because God either allows it or causes that in our life. So he's trying to really tie that together in, I think, a more broader way than what we typically think of every good gift, right?
I would add to that, a lot of times I think back on my life and I see things that didn't, like you were saying, didn't seem good, but I look back now and I think, oh, that was you, Lord. Mm-hmm. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. He says it's every good gift, but he says every perfect gift. So good has the idea of benefiting or profiting us in a positive way. Perfect means it lacks in nothing, right? So the gifts that God gives don't lack in anything. They are suitable for the circumstance. They're suitable for the situation, right? They meet whatever the benefit that God has designed for us in our life at the moment, right? We may have other ideas of what we want, but the idea here of perfection is that it fully and completely meets the need, if that makes sense. So every gift that is beneficial, that meets our needs, comes from God, right? And James had earlier said that that wisdom, true wisdom, comes from God, and now he's saying that every good gift and perfect gift comes from God as well. Now James uses a title here for God that is not used anywhere else in the New Testament. It's only found in some Jewish literature. Philo, the Dead Sea Scrolls has it in it. But this is a unique New Testament name for God. And so whenever you see something that's a little unique, you want to stop and ask yourself, what's the purpose? He could have said, every good gift comes from God. He certainly said that about wisdom coming from God. So what is he trying to convey here by using this really unique title, by calling God the Father of lights? That all these gifts come down. In other words, the idea is there's a reception, that it flows from heaven, from God, down to us. We are the recipients of those good gifts. What's the intention of Father of lights in the context of what he's just been talking about here?
Well, he says there's no shadow.
Correct. He follows up with there's no variation or
There's
shadow.
no shadow or-
Correct.
And if I'm tracking, think about what the Bible says about the witness before the light of darkness. There is no darkness in light.
Mm-hmm.
Just the attribute of light.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe you can overthink this, but the Father of lights is obviously an attribute and a way to pray to God and address it and bring light and clarity
Yeah.
to light to me brings clarity. You see better. You're no longer in the dark.
Yeah, I think there's actually two primary things. One of them is that he's using light in a metaphorical way to distinguish between what he's just talked about, evil gifts or evil things and good gifts. And that wisdom shines light on that. All of a sudden the flashlight comes and you look at it and go, oh, what I thought was a steak is just a rotting piece of meat. I'm glad I looked at it before I put that thing in my mouth, right? And so, Rich, I do think there's a metaphor there that is being used for our ability to understand the good gifts from our, the passionate desires that lead to sin and lead to death. That's one. Any other ideas?
Yeah, so I'm also thinking about in creation, every
Mhm.
time, after every day, and it was good.
Yeah.
And ever since that, the good things are coming from God. Everything good comes from God. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a basic bottom line. And so whenever good things happen in my life, I have a three thing. Thank you, Lord. I do three.
Mhm.
Because I'm saying, I know it came from you.
Yeah, correct. Well, and this clearly is a reference to God's creative act back in Genesis. So not only is it metaphorically being used, I think, Rich, but it's also being used as a callback to God being, when he calls him the Father of lights, it means the creator, Father, the creator, the originator of the lights. Okay? And the reason why he brings that into this context here is that when you think about, today is what? Today's March 12th. I can go on my phone right now and I can tell you exactly when the sun is going to set today. And I can go 3 years from now and I can tell you when the sun is going to set 3 years from now. Right? We have calendars because of sun and the moon. I mean,
Tell you what the tide is gonna be.
the time.
Newport, Oregon.
100%. So from the time of creation, guess what has remained consistent? Sun rises and the sun sets. I mean, metaphorically, it doesn't rise and set. But there's no variation. Now, one day the sun will cease to shine, but that's going to be when God destroys the current heavens and the earth and creates the new heavens and the new earth. But until that time, the Bible even talks about it, that until the sun ceases to shine, this thing will be true. God's, this attribute and stuff is going to be true, that type of thing. And so it's a reference back to the idea that when God put them in place, in fact, God specifically said, I'm putting these in place for what? To separate the days from the night from day, the days and the months and the years, right? And so there isn't any variation. The heavenly bodies he's created, they do exactly what they're supposed to do. They shine light, and they are consistent, right?
I've seen versions of the verse that instead of variation of shadow, I've read shifting shadows, which makes me think of, what was that? And I'm not clear on what that was, and confusion. He's not the father of confusion, father of illumination and clarity. And not
Yeah.
confusion.
Well, and the main purpose here is that he does not change, right? There is no variation or shadow due to change, right? And that's the whole point of talking about the sun and the stars and the moon is they don't change. There's no variation in them. And so just as there's no variation in them, there's no variation in God. God doesn't, and this goes back to what he'd previously said, God doesn't one day tempt you with evil and then the next day give you a good gift. Like, we vary and change all the time. Sometimes we act like complete we're just evil sometimes. We've all done things where we look and go, yeah, you know what? I hope that stays buried and no one ever finds out. And then we can. In fact, James will talk about this later on. With the same mouth we praise God, and with the same mouth we curse our brother. That is like, James is going to be like, the ultimate in variation is how we just go from one to the other. We go from following God to not following God. And he's calling us to perseverance. James is calling us, do not shift, do not change. And he's pointing out that God himself does not change. So God is not going to one day tempt us with evil and the next day give us good gifts. He cannot do that. It's impossible for him. So that every good thing comes from God, right? So if we're trying to pursue those good gifts, we know they come from the Father of lights. Did you have something, Rich?
Well, this is just really good. I mean, it's like really wise counsel.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I've read this chapter many times, and I don't think I've ever looked at it in this order,
Yeah.
in this depth, because I love how you broke it down. From the trials, temptation, wisdom, and gifts, and then really understanding what are the good gifts and what is good. And I think sometimes, particularly for me, but even now, at this point in my life, but as a young man, I could have used this kind of counsel.
Rich, I think we.
Everybody would say that.
Yes, if we all went in the Wayback Machine, there'd be a lot of things that we would.
But it's like people, we yearn for meaning and purpose, understanding why things happen, how things happen.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times the hardest thing to admit is what the mess that you're in is of your own doing.
Yeah.
And as I read through this, there's a difference between, some of what he's talking about here and the mess that you can get in that is clearly of.
Well, and he just talked about in verses 13 through 15. That's what he talked about. When we pursue when we're tempted by our own desires, he says that it gives birth, and then when it's fully grown, it leads to death. Like, that's exactly what he's talking about. We can pursue our own ways of living life. We can pursue our own wisdom, which doesn't come from God, and it will kill you. It will it'll destroy your life. Right.
And even as a parent or a grandparent, there's just incredible wisdom and structure here.
Yeah.
But, we've been talking about this for what, a month?
Yeah.
So, you read through this, and you can miss a lot of what you shared.
Yeah, and I think the important thing for me on this good gift one is that it's easy to identify what we think are good gifts. Got a promotion, got a great job, got a wife that loves me, but we can go through like this, and those are all good gifts, and they all have been provided by God. But I think it's really hard for us sometimes to see what God is doing in our life as a good gift when we would not choose that thing. We wouldn't choose the trial. We wouldn't choose the heartache. And yet God is saying even that is an act of grace, because what I'm building in you, I cannot build in you unless you go through it. It can't be built unless you go through it. It's just like we were talking about working out. You cannot get muscle bound or good cardio by just sitting there. You don't take a pill and you go from sitting on the couch to being, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something like that. It doesn't happen. And so I think for me, that's the thing that I really pull out of this, is that it's very easy for me to identify on the surface what's good. Those are easy. I can give you a laundry list of stuff. It's much harder for me to look at stuff that I've gone through and say, man, that was really painful. But then as I reflect, I'm like, you know what, God, here's what you did. Here's what I learned. Here's what I even learned about myself. Here's how I spiritually advanced. Or here's the stuff that you You taught me. And I think that's what James is referring to here, is like it's the whole kit and caboodle. And if we've got wisdom, we can look at our life experiences, we can look at our trials and tribulations, and even in those, we can understand God has a good gift for us.
So, quick story. About 20 years ago, I'm taking my son hunting with one of his friends. And his friend was going through a lot. He's been in the church with my son. And he's in the back seat, and he says, and I'm talking about spiritual things, and he says, well, I think God has both light and dark in him. And I was like, and I gave him what I thought was a really good explanation, and my son later says, I don't think you did very good with that, Dad. And then I said, well, why didn't you join in?
Well, it's a great topic, guys. It's a question or observation.
Yeah. You know, there is a uniqueness before we just move off this here, is that the word for shadow and the shadow that turns is only used here, nowhere else. It's a unique Jamesism from the biblical perspective. And the idea here is that, he's the father of lights, but even the heavenly bodies will cast shadows. We get eclipses, we get the sun when it shines down through a tree. The tree itself then will cast a shadow, right? And the idea here is that even using these lights that God has fixed as an idea that they don't vary in their cycles and stuff, they do still cast shadows. And so, unlike even that, God is even more separated. Not only does God not vary, but God does not cast shadows. Right? So it goes back to Rich, which is why I said I think James has both of these in play, is that idea that God is the light that chases away every shadow. When he is there, shadows don't exist. When the sun is there, shadows still exist. Now the sun may have no variation in how it's how it is in the space and everything else. It still casts shadows. God does not. So every good gift that God has is basically chases away the shadows. God doesn't cause shadows in our life is sort of what James is saying here. It doesn't come from God, right?
Because you think, what would that really take? Well, it takes a multi-directional source of, almost an infinite
Yes. Yeah.
source of light.
And eventually,
That's everywhere.
Everywhere.
It's from every
we
direction.
won't have the sun, you will be the light.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. That's why there will be no night either. There'll only be day. So for those of us that actually wish that there were more hours in a day and wish that we didn't have to go to sleep at night, that you'll get your wish. There won't be any night. I mean, there's lots of ways that you can take this and be like, even in the future, like there's so much about what we don't understand about God that is going to be, it's just going to be incredible. That He will be this light that will chase away every shadow. Yes.
We would like that.
Yes.
So I have a question. So when he says of his own will, he brought forth by the word of truth. What does he mean? What is the word?
Oh, we're getting to that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, that's verse 18. So let's move to verse 18. Yeah, let's move to verse 18. Where he says, of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Okay? So in verse 18, this kind of segment that he's been in here just ends with this explanation of the position of believers. What is our position as believers? He says by his own will he brought us forth. Well, that concept of brought us forth is the same concept he just talked about with sin being conceived. This is a birthing type of thing, that we have been brought forth. We've been given new life by God. That is our position.
Been regenerated.
We have been regenerated. We have new birth, right? That is what he says, that he brought us forth. And so, because we've been brought forth, we should be living not in our temptations and not in our sins, but we should be living in perseverance, knowing that God sustains us by his good gifts. We are now his sons and daughters. We have been brought forth as a new birth, right? And again, this is another example of the good gift that comes down, the good gift of salvation. He's being very explicit here now, the fact that the good gift that comes from God, one of those things is our new birth, right? And he says that it came by the will of God. Now, will, in this case right here, in the Greek, is in the emphatic position. So Greek doesn't work like English. In Greek, the emphatic, the word that has the most emphasis, the word that is the most important is the one that comes first, right? And so it is in the emphatic position. It is emphatic that it was God's will that he brought forth salvation to us, right? It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't something that he had to be cajoled into, or that he had to really think about it. This was absolutely emphatically his desire and his will to enact this great gift of salvation, right? And it's just, and it's all God. I mean, that's the whole thing. It was his will that brought us forth. He caused salvation to occur in us.
And we were chosen.
We were chosen, correct. He chose us to do it. Now, the means by he did it is by the word of truth. So how was... Now, I don't mean the means by... I don't mean to say not by the death of Christ, but the means in which we became aware of our need for salvation. We became aware of our need for God is through the word of truth. In this case, the word of truth he's referred to is scriptures. That God, again, through his wisdom, created the scriptures for us so that those can be the means by which we discover the truth about God. We discover the truth about ourselves. Now we discover the truth about our need for salvation. And so it's through that word of truth that God then has worked in our lives. That's how all of us have.
By his spirit.
By his spirit, correct.
Guides us into the truth of the word.
Correct.
We read it.
100%.
Gives us that. Just discernment.
The interesting thing to me is this, James is writing before there was any other writing.
Correct. Well, but the Old Testament was there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically what he's referring to here is, in this case, it would have been, because if his book, James, is the first one in the New Testament, you're right, the New Testament hasn't been written. But this is referring back to God and sin, and the Old Testament talks about how God was going to do it. It's going to be through the death of Christ. You've got Isaiah 53.
It's still there, it's just not laid out like it is.
Correct. Now, since he's writing to believers, they know the truth of the death of Christ. That's the only way that they're believers right now is they've accepted Christ as the Messiah, as the Lamb. So he's given them apostolic truth here as well. So you could throw that in there as the word of truth as being the Old Testament plus the revealed word, the words of Christ, the words of the apostles, even if they haven't written them down yet, right?
It's pretty amazing. I don't know like when he wrote this. I think he talked about that later on, but even at that point, I mean, James is fully cognizant of what Nicodemus wasn't. You know, being understood, that concept of being born again, regenerated, of the Pentecost or at the time. And
Sure.
They look, this is good that I leave. I'm gonna send, the helper. At that point, no idea what he's talking about. But by whatever period of time this transpired.
This is probably about 3 to 5 years after the ascension of Christ.
But
So,
he understands that now.
yes, correct.
How God is in us, to regenerate us and works in us.
Yep.
Through the power of his word and his scripture, whether spoken or
Yeah.
read.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's where wisdom. This is why I say James, the Old Testament comparison to James is Proverbs. Proverbs tells you how to live. Proverbs tells you how to live. Don't do this. Don't walk by the way of the harlot. I mean, all the stuff you just go through Proverbs, and that's just all what it's all about. And James is basically bringing Proverbs in but expanding more on it from a theological perspective versus having these pithy kind of Proverbs. He's now taking that to say, how can you live that out as a Christian? But it's the Old Testament sort of version of the book of James.
You know, Proverbs, like, you know, practical wisdom that you would learn through experience, I suppose. And James, the only way you learn that is just by walking as a regenerated believer,
Yeah,
sharing that.
correct. Yeah, so this idea of the word of truth also, though, it's referenced, if you want to, Romans 10:17, 1 Corinthians 4:15, 2 Thessalonians 2:13, 1 Peter 1:23 through 25. So this idea of the word of truth as being the way in which the gospel message comes is not unique to James. He's just the first one to use that term because his book is the earliest of the New Testament. Romans 10:17, 1 Corinthians 4:15, 2 Thessalonians 2:13, and 1 Peter 1:23 through 25. So just like death, just like sin brought forth or conceived and brought forth death, here God's word births and brings forth life. And you have these two things juxtaposed at the very end. Death is the result of one, life is the result of the other one, right? And that's what he wants to keep reminding his
Why
believers.
does he use the word creatures rather than men? What's with creatures?
Yeah, it's I'd have to look at the actual Greek to see what the actual Greek is there on that. Certainly, it refers to a created order. And likely it's because it's the first fruits of a certain created order, right? So using creatures versus man would indicate how God created. He created all kinds of creatures, but in this case, the creature he's talking about is the creature of man. But
Well, when you come to Christ, you become a new creature.
yeah, I mean, I
It's
can.
always stuck in my mind, like, how about a new man?
Yeah, I
In the New International Version, it says we might be kind of first fruits of all he created.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
it's-
kind of what Randall said.
Yeah, it's really referring back to, he talked about the Father of lights in the previous verse, so it harkens back to creation, so that's probably why he uses that verse. That word versus that. But let me see here if I can just quickly just do a word study on this just for a second here.
The New Living Translation says, and we, out of all creation, became his prized possession, which might equate to being a first fruit, best fruits, prized fruits.
It's a small point, but I just.
Yeah. Well, for some reason my phone's not working right now to get to that. But he says here now, he says, so he says that this is, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Now, that's interesting here because remember, who is James writing to? Yes, the Jews. So specifically, this last part here of his creatures are those who are saved. In other words, the creation of new believers. He's just talked about new birth, right? He brought us forth. So this new creation of new birth, these Jews are the first of that kind. They were the first to believe. So this is why it reads that way, the first fruits of his creatures, right? So all his creatures are all believers who come to faith through Jesus as the Messiah. but there's a segment of them who are the first fruits. They are somehow distinctive, right? Now, some commentators have tried to say that this is believers of the apostolic age versus those of future generations, but he specifically, the context of James tells us that that's not correct. He's been talking to Jewish believers, and Jewish believers were the first fruits. They were the first ones to come to faith in Jesus Christ. And then it was only when Peter was told to go and open the gates of salvation to the Gentiles, remember? And he told God, I'm not going to do it. God told him the sheet comes down and there's the food and eat it. And he goes, I won't eat that. I'm not going to defile myself. It's only until then that Peter was then sent to open up the gates of the kingdom to the Gentiles, that then they became his creatures as well. So the Jews were the first fruits. And the first fruits, from a biblical perspective, is the first of a thing, the first fruits of the harvest. And when you gather those first fruits and you offer them to God, it's an indication, those first fruits are an indication of more to come, right? When you see the first fruits come, you realize that there's going to be more later on. And so the Jews then were the first fruits that came to believe in Christ. And James is just saying, hey, look, you're the first fruits of God's new creation. So you have a distinctive position. He came to you first, delivered salvation to you first. Is what Paul says in Romans 1:16, right? It was to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. So that's what he means here by that they are a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Right?
Would this is just probably esoteric, but would a Jew who becomes a believer today still be considered a first fruits? Because of their heritage?
I think James would say, and remember at this point, the Apostle Paul probably has not been converted yet. He's probably still persecuting the church.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's even at this point, it's unclear exactly whether or not the Gentiles have been completely brought in yet. We don't know exactly the timing on that. So likely, again, I can't say this for sure, likely he's referring to those first Jews that became the believers, and then once the Gentiles got brought in, then all of God's creatures are now brought in there. So I think it's a timing, but specifically it was the Jews that came to believe first, yeah.
I like to say he's a completed Jew.
Yeah. And if you look at Hebrews chapter 12:23, that's where the writer of Hebrews, he describes, one group of the New Jerusalem as residents as coming from the general assembly and church of the firstborn, right? So the church of the firstborn are the Jews in that case. So it's a good question about whether or not that would still apply to Jews today or whether it was just the Jews at the time. But certainly it is in reference to the Jews. Yeah. So that's where we're going to kind of that's where we're going to kind of leave off for today. We'll start off in 19. So as you kind of just, Joe, I'm glad you're tracking with the thoughts of how James has started this whole thing out. We're to consider joy. How are we to consider joy? God gives us this wisdom. The joy comes because it produces perseverance and stuff. God's the one that then gives us wisdom to figure out how to do that. We're called to persevere. God's promised us blessings when we persevere. If we don't persevere, don't blame it on God. But God has the good gifts that allow us to persevere, that allow us to get through stuff in life, and they all come from Him. Now when we read 19, keep that in mind. Look at what the flow of James is going forward, because really his book is just a flow. It just starts and he continues to build and build upon that flow. But wisdom is the key cornerstone thought of the book of James.
In the application of it.
Yes.
He's about to go into prove it.
Yeah, exactly. But that shows whether or not you have true wisdom, right? Because when we start getting into the application of it, because wisdom is, the true application of right knowledge, right? That's what it is. So wisdom would then say, how then are you acting? Do your actions show you're wise, or do they not? Because if you're wise, you'll know not to do this, or you'll know to do this. And in fact, James will eventually say in James chapter 4 that for whatever for what a man knows that's right to do and doesn't do it, to him it's sin, right? So again, it goes back to that right application. When we know the right application of something in life and we don't do it, that's sin. So this whole thing of wisdom is just going to just permeate the whole rest of the book of James.
When I first started, when James came on my radar, it was back in the days of Jim Wright's Tuesday morning classes. And we weren't studying it, but I was speaking early on after class with Bob Hamilton about, something in my life. Anyway, he said, read James. He goes, when he was a young